Hey everybody, it's Kelly. Welcome back to another episode of Ask a Therapist. As August continues, we are taking this week to talk about religion and victim blaming. There's a pretty deep connection between the two, and I think it's time that we maybe address that and talk about sort of where that comes from, and also how to get past that if it has happened to you. Before we get into that too far, I want to go ahead and ask you to subscribe, to hit the thumbs up and like the video, and also to hit the bell so that you can be notified when I publish. Don't forget to comment. We've had some lively exchange in the comment section recently, and I'd love to get your voice there too. Thanks so much. All right, let me explain what I mean by victim blaming. In situations where there is a perpetrator and a victim, oftentimes religions will default to blaming the person who was harmed. Sometimes that's because the person who did the harming is in some sort of authority, sometimes because we don't really understand the mental anguish that someone is going through, and so we put our own understanding on that. But there are three specific places that religions, specifically churches, really do this a lot. The first one is in sexual assault type situation, physical too, but mostly sexual, in situations of mental health and in situations of physical illness, or even bad things that happen to you. I think that can be clumped in with physical illness. So let's start with the physical illness because that's the simplest, right? If you grew up in any kind of religious institution, I'm sure you heard from a pretty early age about people who were healed by the power of prayer. Someone is sick or they have something as slight as a cold to as big as cancer, and had a whole group of people praying for them, and they were able to get healthy, feel better, recover, whatever it is, right? And that's fantastic. If that is what was helpful to someone, that's a great thing. There's zero problem there. The problem comes when we turn it around either purposefully or not purposefully and essentially make it the person who didn't recover, it was because their faith wasn't strong enough. It's because they didn't believe enough, or they didn't pray enough, or maybe they didn't have enough friends praying for them. But for whatever reason, they did not recover, and it must be the fault of the amount of faith that they have. So that's one. The next area is mental health, and for me, this is a particularly frustrating part, obviously. Let me tell you a story. It's a story about a girl who was at a Christian college, and she went to the college counseling center to get help for the fact that she was having so many thoughts that just wouldn't keep coming, and they were pretty negative, not anything necessarily life-threatening, but definitely distracting from everyday productivity. When she was finally able to get in and talk to someone in the counseling center, their recommendation was that she pray. So every time she had these racing thoughts, or every time she was confused about what was going on, or every time she felt bad, she should pray. And that prayer meant that God would then intercede and help her through her struggle. And that advice helped until it didn't. And then when it didn't, all of those thoughts and those feelings came back. But on top of all that was this shame, because it had been very clearly explained that if you have enough faith, which is really the faith the size of a mustard seed, tiny, teeny, tiny little seed, you can move mountains. That's what churches say. So if this person had faith even as big as a mustard seed, then God would have taken those thoughts away permanently, and she wouldn't have had to keep going back and praying and giving it to him and figuring that out. And the bottom line here for this is that that girl had anxiety, and while in reality praying can be a good coping skill, it is not the only coping skill that a therapist should be teaching their clients. Christian or not, there's a multitude of ways of dealing with mental health, and pray and it will go away is not one of them. Now, lest anybody be concerned, that person was me. I'm not telling anyone else's story except for my own. But I'm sure all of you have heard stories similar to this, where you have a legitimate mental health episode and they are told by their religious leaders to pray and God will fix it. But the other side of that is that if you don't pray right or you don't pray enough, then God doesn't answer it, but it's your fault. It's not God's fault you have this problem anyway. It's like sin in the world or something. If you are not healed from the problem, it is also not God's fault because you did something wrong. I want to go back to that quote for a minute. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. That insinuates that if you're not moving mountains with your faith, then your faith is not big enough or not strong enough, because all you need is a little tiny mustard seed worth of faith, and then you've got what you need to do anything, even feats that require inhuman strength. So that's on you if you don't get that fixed. The amount of gaslighting going on in this particular phenomenon is astounding, especially when we take it to the next level and prescribe it to things like sexual assault. And in that, I'm including also verbal assault that is sexual in nature. I'm including all of those things because this is something we see in the church all of the time, in every denomination, really in every religion, where the understanding of purity and modesty and what God wants us to do and be and how God wants us to act takes over everything, but it's only how the people in charge prescribe that information. So it goes like this. I had a married pastor at one point in my life. And that married pastor was sleeping with women who were not his wife. And what do you think the people said about that? Across the board, the thing that I heard the most, even as a younger person, I was hearing,
what is she doing wrong at home? Or what is she not doing at home that he has to go somewhere else to get those needs satisfied?
If you're paying attention to some of these stories of pastors and youth pastors who have taken advantage of those under them, typically you'll also see stories of grooming, how they spent lots of specific time with this person and this person was a target for them, never felt like a target probably because it happens very slowly. But then when you turn it around, they look at this other person who was taken advantage of, who was gaslit, who was groomed, who was coerced, and it's their fault. Or, and this one's, you have two parties and one has assaulted the other and they're both like within the same religious community. The person who is the victim is asked not to press charges or not to have retaliation of any kind because they don't want to ruin the other person's life for a simple mistake. And so the protection is on the person who has done the wrong because, I don't know, that's a more redemptive story or that's a story that doesn't make everybody feel bad. I don't know. But for whatever reason, the focus is still on fixing things for the person who did the wrong thing in the first place. And the person who has had the wrong done to them has to just suck it up for the greater good. Now that we've gone over the ways that it can happen, let's talk about why. In order to understand how deep this goes, we need to go back to the very first story that is in the Bible. The story of Adam and Eve is the very first victim blaming. Growing up, the way the story was always relayed to me in Sunday school and in church is that Eve and Adam were in the garden. There was a tree they weren't allowed to eat from, and God also put a serpent in the garden. And the serpent saw Eve one day when she was going around and collecting food, and the serpent said to Eve, eat, and then you'll know everything, and you'll understand why God doesn't want you to eat this tree. And the fruit was so beautiful, and so Eve ate it, and then took it back to Adam, who also ate it. And then they were filled with knowledge and the understanding of life and death. And then they were no longer welcome in the Garden of Eden. What did you hear in that story? Because growing up, I always heard the woman was deceived and then she deceived the man. So the woman is both the deceived and the deceiver. And the man who also ate the apple has no ownership. What is that? If we are to believe this story happened literally, then we need to be realistic about what we are saying happened. We have a woman who was responsible for the food preparation, maybe that day, maybe they did share it, who knows, but responsible for the food preparation, who prepared dinner for Adam. We have a woman who was coerced and deceived by someone, victim, and then went about the things she needed to do. There's no indication that she knew what she was doing to Adam when she gave him the fruit. The way that is written out is that Eve was deceived, she ate the apple, and then she gave it to Adam. And then they both knew. Again, in that story, there is no onus on Adam. The idea of blaming the victim keeps the perpetrator, or those who resonate with the perpetrator, those who identify with the identity of the perpetrator, it keeps them from having to deal with their own problems. And so when we say,
well, this person is depressed because they aren't focusing enough on the things that God has given them.
Or this person is anxious because they've chosen fear over trust in God.
This person's cancer didn't go away because they don't have a strong enough or genuine enough faith.
Or this person was assaulted because they weren't where they should have been and they were wearing something they should have been wearing.
When we do those things, we are taking the onus off of anyone else except for the person who's already been hurt. And I think on some level, it's because people see them as already harmed, already damaged. They want to focus that They want to focus that damage. So I'm here to tell you today that people are not damaged. People aren't broken. They're not lost. They're not damaged. People have had circumstances that have led them in certain ways. We've all made decisions. Some of them we wish we had never made, and some of them we're glad we made. But what we do not do, what we have to stop doing, is blaming the person for our own problems. When a person is assaulted, when a person is catcalled, when a person is sexually taken advantage of in any kind of a way, the questions that get asked are things like, what was she wearing? Where was she? Was she alone? And yes, I am saying she, because by and large, this happens much more to women than it does to men. We expect women to dress not provocatively because you might lead the men astray, but we don't expect the men to keep themselves in check. I'm going to tell you something that you should know by now. Are you ready? Bodies are not sexual. Bodies are not sexual. Inherently, the human body is not sexual. What you may do with another human body may be sexual. What you may do with your own body might be sexual. What you think when you look at someone else's or your own body may also be sexual. But that's what you're bringing in. That's not what that body has. So anytime we talk about people dressing too provocatively or not covering up enough or not being modest, the people who are saying that are reflecting their own insecurities and confusion and responses to that stimuli. That's all we're talking about. I want this to be a message of empowerment and understanding. Your body is your body. No one has a right to it except for you and the people you allow access to it. There is not an inherent responsibility on anyone to perform and structure their body and their clothing in a way to make life easier for someone else unless they have chosen to. Our bodies are our own and our thoughts are our own, but we have this habit, and it comes from religious organizations, to take all of that and put it on others. I'm not here to rag on what you believe, and I have some pretty specific beliefs of my own. I would not necessarily care for someone punching holes in them. That said, it is not okay for us to take these stories we heard as children and apply them to everyday cognitive behavior today. When we take responsibility for our own actions, when I look at someone and I appreciate their body and I begin to think sexual thoughts, when I don't blame them for my sexual thoughts, but I say, that person is actually not a piece of meat and they're not here for my sexual gratification, then I am responsible for removing my sexual thoughts from the situation. And it has nothing to do with them. It is all me, right? The amount of harm that victim blaming has done to people over the years, the amount of guilt that grown adults carry now because they think they weren't good enough to have God remove certain emotions from their lives, or they think they did something wrong and so their parents divorced, or so they got divorced, or so maybe somebody they know died and they think they didn't pray hard enough, or it's a reaction or an aggressive response, something they did wrong. All of those thoughts come from the fact that from very, very early, Christianity does not actually teach you to take responsibility for your actions. If you need further proof, I'd encourage you to look at something like the Salem witch trials, where women, just for being women, were burned at the stake because men felt sexually about them. Humans were tortured and killed because a group of people could not take ownership of their own emotions. Now that I think about it, I think that happens a lot in the name of religion. The things we do to the people around us, physically in front of us, for a God that we can't see, are atrocious. The ways that people use this idea of this all-powerful entity in order to excuse only what they want is offensive. So for those of you who have been on the end of victim blaming, who blame yourselves for things that happened that were outside of your control, I want you to understand that this situation should never have happened to you. Whatever it is that has been done to you should never have happened. And I am sorry for that. But know that you do not have to continue to carry it. I don't want to take the responsibility off of the people who've perpetrated these things, but I also want to clarify that I do not think that everyone does it intentionally, but I think that's part of the problem, is we spend so much time not really thinking about things like mental health and accountability and emotional stability within these entities, but we have all of these very emotionally manipulative things that are structured to get us to respond on a deeper level so we can get deeper with God. The whole while we are leaving people in our wake that are harmed in real ways, but we either ignore it because we're not self-aware enough to know what we've done, or we're too afraid to actually do anything about it because then we have to admit our part in it. That's it for today. Next week, we'll be talking about religious trauma and emotional manipulation. Super fun, lots of things to talk about as far as youth ministries and retreats go. Don't forget to comment, to subscribe, and to share this video if you found it helpful. And I will see you next week. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other.